Reloading Bench back with you. Let's talk scales. I'm not a fan of this scale. Anybody who buys a Lee kit will get this scale. And when I say I'm not a fan of it, it's nothing to do with this particular scale. I'm just not a big beam fan because of the time to either dial in a weight or to do a specific type of measurement with a powder. So I've got the scale. I think a whole lot of people have the scale. If electricity ran out and I had no batteries for other things, I may opt for this, but for the time being, this is where it's stayed for years, and this is where it will continue to stay. So I would say this was my first scale, and the one scale I own that has never been used. First scale I actually used and used quite a bit when I was just getting into reloading, and one of the reasons I picked it up, it was small, didn't take up a lot of bench space. At the time I thought that being battery operated was positive. I've got no real complaints on the scale, except, and this is indicative of any battery operated scale, it's battery operated. And during a reloading session, when you're zeroing, testing weights, and measuring powder, it just chews through batteries. So it lasted, or rather I used it for quite a while, and then when I figured that I was spending more in batteries than what I paid for the scale, then it was time to look for a new alternative. I waited on this scale for a long time. A lot of manufacturers have a habit, and it's not just in reloading, of announcing a product, showing a video or mock-up of it or what have you, and this was one of them. I remember when this was first announced, and it was probably around the turn or end of one year. I want to say something like maybe 2012, possibly. Yeah, I think it was before 2013, but maybe end of 2011 into 12, or end of 12 into 13. Regardless, they were announced. I think the price was right around $100, 95. Find it on sale for maybe the mid 80s, and this was a godsend for me, simply because it made it's a robust scale to me. I've never had any issues with it. Comes with a 10 and a 50 gram weight. I think those were 10 and 50. Yeah. And one of the things I also opted to pick up, and I would recommend anyone else, and this only goes out to 1/10 of a grain, but depending on your precision shooting and measuring of powder, and if you've got a higher end scale, you may want to pick up some more delineated weights, smaller than just a 10 or a 50 or 100 grain weight. And I can't remember what this cost and or when or where I got it. I want to say probably online and on sale, but just another way of checking weights. But this was a godsend. It lasted about a year and a half, and then it broke. And when I called Hornady about it, the Hornady warranty doesn't quite apply to electronics like this, stuff that's most likely made overseas, as opposed to their presses and such. So I was out of luck, but I like this so much that I went and bought another one. So this has done very well for me, and this is my go-to scale. So a few years after getting the electronic Hornady scale, and I know they've come out with a newer version of that, I believe a little smaller, less expensive, same functionality. I saw this, and I had gotten a gift card for a holiday event, and it was also on sale. So for the net, this essentially cost me $50. And the reason I went with this is for the ability to do a charge and weigh that charge for more precision hand loading. And one of the big advantages for me using this particular scale is when I'm loading for the 416 Barrett. Almost identical in terms of what the other scale does, but since this can distribute powder, and I know a lot of people have bashed it because if you set it for a certain particular grain weight, and regardless of the powder, it seems, and regardless of how you program this to either slow down and then slow the trickle before reaching or stepping up to the weight, it has a propensity to overcharge. And the way I get around that is using a trickle charge. So what I do is I will usually or lower my weight and my charge weight. And if I'm like for the Barrett, if I need 190 grains, I'll set this to 189.5. And what'll usually happen more times than not is it'll come in like at 189.8 or 9 with the overcharge. And then what I simply do is I just trickle charge. And that works out great for me. So I get the best of both worlds, precision without having to do all of the over, redo, and I also trickle charge with the other scale as well. So this is kind of a best of both worlds when I'm either experimenting with loads or wanting to do something more on the precision, where I'm not just dropping powder from one of my powder drops that is on one of the presses. So this has worked out quite well for me. A little cumbersome to clean because you have to empty it just from that spout. So it's got its pros and cons, but it's held true to the weights when I'm using it. Not had any problems with it. I've had it a few years, and again, I like the ability to trickle with it. So it has a purpose on the bench, but this is not my go-to scale. So this is my favorite scale, and not because of usage, but because of what I would call the combination of factors. It's a much higher end two beam balance scale that also has a dial, and that's what I find really cool. Whereas some of the other balance beam scales, some of the other beam scales rather, seem a little more crude. This one, really cool scale. In fact, this paperwork is dated 2003, but it's the Dialogram Balance by OHAS. And what's cool about this is, well, there are a couple things. I picked this up online, and I got a phenomenal deal. And the guy who was selling it had also made this awesome giant wooden carry case that is very protective of the scale. And what's cool about this is this will also give me down to a tenth of a grain. So it'll do 300 grains plus this, so 310 grains. But I think what's really cool about it, especially for some precision stuff, because you'll always have somebody say, well, if you have a digital lock on your safe, what happens when the big boom comes and the EMP goes off and you can't get into your safe? Well, what happens when you've got no electricity or your batteries are dead and you want to do something by hand in terms of measuring a powder weight? Not that anything would get ever that bad, but I think it's just cool to have something like this, an older piece of history for what it does. And these are the folks that actually made the RCBS version of the exact same scale, and I think that goes for like $350. I picked this one up, I think, for $80 shipped with the wooden case. So this was a great, almost a steal. But the fact that you could dial the tenth of a grain, I think, is incredibly cool and very precise. So without a doubt, this is a favorite scale from an old school beam/dial point of view. Very cool.